artistic director here at the Bristol Old Vic, and I'm also the director of Choir Boy. And this is a first of many stage talks that we're exploring on doing here at the Bristol Old Vic on certain themes that come out from the play. Before I go into my spiel about Choir Boy, I just want to introduce who's here with me that's going to be having a conversation with me today. Aisha Thomas. Aisha studied law before an epiphany saw her move to education and become assistant principal at an inner city secondary school. Today, she is an educational consultant in her own organization, Representation Matters Limited, and has a firm focus on anti-racist practice, equity, justice, and liberation. Aisha has presented a BBC documentary about the lack of black teachers in Bristol and delivered a TEDx talk, Why Representation Really Matters. She won Positive Role Model for Race Ethnicity at the Bristol Diversity Awards 2020, received a 2021 Special Recognition Award from Bristol Black History Month magazine, and won the 2021 Batten Award, is that Batten? Yeah, Batten Awards Campaigner of the Year. Aisha is also a university guest lecturer, and her debut book, Becoming an Anti-Racist Educator, was released on 12 May 2022. I got the book. Desmond Brown, to my left. Desmond Brown is founder and CEO of Growing Futures UK, a community interest company which works with children, young people, and their families impacted by school exclusions, serious youth violence, child criminal sexual exploitation. Desmond is the independent chair of the Avon and Somerset Criminal Justice Oversight Panel. Oh my God, it's such a mouthful. And sits as vice chair on A&S Office of the Police and Crime Commissioners Independent Scrutiny of Police Powers Panel. Y'all got that? In March 2022, Desmond published his report commissioned by the local Criminal Justice Board, identifying disproportionately in the A&S CJ system, which highlighted the issue of the school-to-prison pipeline in A&S. Desmond continues to offer consultancy and training to law enforcement and educationalists with partners both in the UK and internationally. Since starting...
Well done. That was great.
I'm not the best sight reader either.
That's good.
From my time being here at the Bristol Old Vic, we've been exploring lots of different things and how we can engage more with the community, how we can engage with broader Bristol. And with Choir Boy in particular, there's been different activity that we've been doing around the production. One was, I don't know if anyone was here for it, but we did the Big Sing, which was in late September, where the whole day we decided to do workshops around choirs. We had choir performances out in the dais, workshops around singing for well-being, singing technique, and also looking at the differences between UK and US gospel music. And part of the reason was because choirs play a very huge part in Choir Boy. And we wanted to explore what was of interest here in Bristol. I found out months ago that there are about over 65 choirs in the city, but if you count the church choirs, there's over 100. So we thought we do need to do an activity around that, and it was just such a beautiful, gorgeous day that ended with Femi Tamawowo, who was our musical director, leading, I think it was like 167, I don't know if Tundin's here with some numbers, but it was like 167 participants, which he put into like alto and tenor and soprano, and everyone learning a song from the show. And it was just such a beautiful experience and so close to the theme in the play in how we can achieve a sense of spiritual healing through singing together. So today, one of the themes that we really want to talk about is education. So I know some of you have not seen the play, so I'm not going to give any spoilers, but I just want to put it a little bit into context. Choir Boy is set in an elite black boys institution in America. There is a very long history of black colleges and universities in America, and part of the reason why Terrell Alvin McCraney wrote the play was because he was prompted by the playwright August Wilson, who was his mentor for quite a long time, to think about legacy and what does that mean. And there are various reasons why these institutions came to be. One, because there was no integration of schools for a very long time in America. And there was a sense of needing to be able to create environments where Black people could be educated by other Black people. But this started long before these schools started, in the 40s and the 50s. It really starts from what we would call hush harbors during times of enslavement, which were, you could say, invisible schools or invisible churches where enslaved peoples would come together, educate each other on different things, and also create music together. So a lot of the music that comes in to play in choir boy are spirituals that come from, very old Christian hymns, but they were retranslated, for a better word. But these hush harbors became really, really important because it was a community deciding to take care of its own community in furthering themselves through education and getting through whatever they needed to get through. So what we find is that these schools, for the most part, which so many of them still exist today, Howard and Spelman are very good examples of very big universities with very high reputation for education. What we found is that a lot of these schools were actually started by pastors, church leaders, because one way that the African American community could have status is through religion. They were positions that were very well respected, people that were very educated, people that were there to support the needs of that community. And so you see, Martin Luther King is probably one of the biggest examples of a religious leader that then became a civil rights leader. But it was very important that the preservation of Black education was in Black hands. Now, that is not as simple as that sounds, because with all the goodwill, you need financing. So you would find that a lot of these institutions were, needed white philanthropy. And so you had quite a lot of white donors that would give to this education, but then were also on the board, were also part owners, and also had a say in what this Black education would be. A little bit later, we're going to talk about Black excellence and what we think that might mean. But I first of all, wanted to just give you a little bit of context around education and the theme of education. But the play itself follows a group of young boys who are going through what every young boy goes through in trying to get good grades and trying to figure out his social group, trying to figure out what parents want from them and what they might want for themselves. It's boys growing into men. The added challenges is that there are certain expectations put upon them as young Black boys to, again, fulfill this path of excellence and this pressure that is put upon them. Before anything else, what did you guys think of the play? Aisha!
Pressure. All right. I don't want to do any spoilers, but what I would say is that I found the play really transformational because it was a moment where I could kind of connect as an educator. I was previously an assistant principal, so there was an education connection. I'm a mother of 2 Black boys, so straight away I could see my son, particularly my 15-year-old. But what was really interesting for me is that the themes translated from kind of joy and excitement, but then to trauma and pain. But one of the things that I guess resonated with me, but left me feeling a little bit empty, was we don't have the equivalent kind of HBCUs here. We don't have those kind of historical institutions that focus on Black excellence. And where in America you have these kind of ideas that what does African American Black excellence in education look like? We don't have that here in the UK. And I left feeling a sense of emptiness where I thought, actually, our Black British children who want to aspire to that level of excellence and have that kind of connection and coding between themselves, it was missing. And so for me, it was a representation, again, of why I guess myself and Desmond do the work that we do, because Black children here just don't have that opportunity in this education system. And they're constantly trying to work out, what's my identity as a Black British person in the UK, and what does that mean for me in understanding my education identity? So it was beautiful and it was joyous, but I also felt a sense of loss and regret for our children here.
Thank you. Desmond.
What she said. No, absolutely agree with what Aisha said. I think for me, I went through a British version of that. I went to a Catholic boys' school. My mother was Irish, my father's Jamaican. But we were poor family, and we were kind of like the at the time, half-caste kids that my mum dragged around. So this school accepted us through that religion, but we were always seen, I was always reminded that I was very lucky to go to this school. Even though my mum was working 2 jobs to pay for me to go there, I was very lucky. So I kind of, from the play, I really took some of those, it was all boys' school, you know, that identity, search for identity, sexuality, belonging, the whole thing. And so that's what really drew me. It was obviously quite different because I grew up in a white environment where I was the other. And we actually had a talk before this, you know, I would love to see an education system where we could have black excellence schools. And I think sometimes that jars against British culture because we have this idea that there's equality and we should stick to that. But I think there is a need and working with children for their identity that is missing in our education system. And it's very important. And it almost defines when we have the exclusion rates that we have in our schools, especially in Bristol, that we understand that some of that is because the identity work isn't taking place. That we are seeing behaviours in young black boys that we're not seeing, but we're demonising those rather than understanding what those are and what that is. You know, from my own viewpoint, I saw within the play so much that just kind of touched on it. And sorry, to go back to the play, I really found that the characters held me. I was introduced to the characters one by one, but it didn't feel like it was this character. And now it just seemed to flow, and I could identify with each of them. And it wasn't too many for me to deal with. So, but I felt something from each of them, and the songs, and as he said, you know, these spiritual songs, and looking at history and how they were used by people from the heritage that I do hold. It was just very linking those emotional feelings now to a legacy that we have, and I really felt it watching it. I did kind of start to understand and learn that there is this connection that goes back in time that we still need to look at and learn from.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned school exclusions, and as I've already said, I'm not the person with the data and the numbers, but I do know that there's been a rise of school exclusions here in the UK since the pandemic. And I wonder if both of you can speak to your own experience working here in Bristol, because so much of this conversation is around just taking the theme of Choir Boy, but understanding how it is impacting us here today.
Yeah, well, so Bristol has over-averaged the school exclusions in the UK, especially for black and minoritized young men, but girls are slowly catching up. I think for me, to talk around the play and the issues in the play, we spend £120,000 a year to incarcerate a young person. Now, if we look at the latest statistics, we have 18% of the UK is of black minority ethnic background, but yet half of our youth prisons are full with black and minoritized people. So there is something going wrong. I think we need to identify that. And you know, for me, we're paying more to send people to prison than we would send them to Eton or to Harrow. And I think there is this idea of, you know, why did this start? So mass incarcerations in the UK started in the 90s under Thatcher, where they converged with this mass incarceration that was happening in America with racialized drug use. In the 90s, we had muggings, which was then a real big thing that was put on a group of black men, and this is what they're doing. And we saw incarceration rates increase. So for me, what the gap is that we kind of, these young people have missed out on the hopes and aspirations of a community and their ancestors, and we basically, and they put themselves in this role as the villain. And I think that we could better serve our criminal justice system if we started to deal with some of those issues. We would actually build positive people for the society that could work for the society for the enhancement of it. And I think this is an issue that we need to deal with, is education. And sorry, I could talk all night.
That's what we want. That's why you're here.
I think my perspective on it is slightly different, and I guess I'm going from the educator's perspective. If you think about the teacher training program, if you think about the training that teachers get or people who work in education, there is no mandatory training in England that says that teachers will receive anti-racist training or even cultural integration. So imagine being asked to do a job, but you have no preparation or cultural understanding. So there's kind of a responsibility on an individual to want to be racially literate, and not a guidance and a principle and almost a commitment. And when I compare it to Wales, although it's quite new, in Wales, they've now made this mandatory. So all schools have to do this. Everybody has to teach Black history. It's a movement that all people have to have. When it's still optional, and when you are in a position where you might be interpreting some of our political viewpoints which do not underpin that this should happen in an education setting, we have to remember that the people who are educating are also still human beings. They have a job that they do, but they have a life that they live outside of school. And so schools become a microcosm of what you see in society. So the fact that I might watch something on the news, or I might have an interaction with an individual, do you think when a person gets to school, they hang that up and they forget those views? Of course not. That's translated into their practice and their ideas and their behaviors. So I do an activity in my training, and I use my son as an example, but people don't know it's my son. So I put my son on the board, and he's sat there, and he's got his T-shirt on, and you don't necessarily know it's him. And I get educators to just tell me what you think, tell me what you feel. I get students to do it, and you hear things like gangster, criminal, he should be in Top Boy, he should be in Power. Like, that's the sort of commentary that you're hearing. And then I say, but that's my son. And all of a sudden, once they hear it's my son, he's no longer adultified, they contextualize it and they see him as a human being, and there's a lack of humanity that's happening. So when you have a society that's perpetuating this idea that Black boys are bad, Black boys are to be feared, Black boys are criminals, Black boys are going to hurt you, then that will translate into your practice, even for the best practitioner. So I think it's really important for us to recognize that we're not doing enough to dismantle that ideology that Black boys have to walk around with before they even step in your classroom.
So I will say something. We had a drama therapist that was involved supporting this production, Samantha Adams, and I've worked with her. I think this is the 5th production that I've worked with her in very different capacities. But so important it is to be able to hold a space where we can discuss the nuances of the language that we're using, but also that the actors performing will have a very close lived experience to some of their characters as well. And we talked a lot about anti-Blackness and these roles that we sort of play out unconsciously in society. And in the most simple way, I guess I can put it, is in almost thinking that if you have lived your whole life looking at people of color and Black people of service, and now that they are in a leadership position, how are you then, how are you navigating that relationship? Because that feels very foreign to you. And that seems to be a really, really important thing that we needed to be able to uncover. You wanted to ask me something around anti-racism work here. It's really difficult. I think, Bristol Old Vic is gearing into becoming an anti-racist organization, and we have to talk about anti-Blackness and whatever we hold in our unconscious, as I just mentioned, and how do we create a desire to want to make change in the world because it becomes a personal value, not just because of something that you're doing for work. And so important for me is that we are able to diversify the stories that we put on stage. And the reason why, the drama therapist was so essential was because these are tender stories that we don't see very often on stage. One of the main reasons why I wanted to do Choir Boy was because I often see stories of young Black boys who are adultified too early and are in very violent, very harsh conditions. And I'm not by any means saying that that is not true and that doesn't exist. I grew up in Brooklyn in the 80s, yes, I know. But I don't see brotherhood very often. I don't see boys loving on each other and hugging each other. And Sam, our drama therapist, was the first time she saw the run of it, was just so emotional because of the lack of experience of being able to witness that. it is really important that we, as Aisha said, we keep platforming our humanity. That was essential for me in this story, and I think that is essential to the anti-racism work that we're doing here at Bristol Old Vic. A long-winded way, sorry, of getting to that point.
Can I just say, just around that though, I think, you know, I work in a world where there's school exclusions, serious youth violence, and sometimes you can get caught up in that and think that's the whole world. Actually, there's much more people who are having the relationships that you're talking about within different communities that isn't what we see on TV. We don't see it as well. So I think that there are some narratives that are forced, that there has to be a kind of painful narrative. We don't see a black mother and a father loving each other, bringing up a family. We hear about the single mother and the struggle and the gangster or the downbeat dad, or we have these images. And I think, you know, so it is very important that we are able to go through the whole version of the emotions that we all have, rather than it just being limited to Top Boy, a single mother living in a bedsit where things are hard. There are relationships and great things happen, children succeeding within our communities. So I do think that that's why it's also important, because I think there is that narrative of ghettoisation that is part of the issue that our young peoples are receiving, and believing that is the only option, is get rich or die trying.
Now, I gotta say, just from speaking from my own career as a freelance theater director for the last 20 years, I've directed a lot of trauma stories. I've directed a lot of really hard stories. And one, they were stories I did want to direct because they were things that I needed to explore for myself, stories that I felt needed to be told. But also I started finding, and this is something that we all really do need to think about more, that these were the stories people wanted to see as well. They didn't want to see the other things I was pitching about just black joy and just the simple stories. And that's another, you know, question for another day, but how our humanity can just be limited in so many ways. Something that we talked about earlier, and I want to just bring back, was around black identity and black excellence. Could you, the best way you can, just give me your definition of those things?
Do you know what? I can't define it, and I don't want to define it, and I tell you why. When I think about what it is to be racialised as black, particularly in a British geographical context, we are almost told there's only one version of blackness. And if you don't show up like this, you're not black enough. If you don't show up like this, you know, you can't win. And I think I went to a school which was predominantly racialised as white, and I spent the best part of my youth being called a coconut because all my friends were white, and I was in an environment where my mum was sending me to South Gloucestershire every single day, and I wasn't white enough for those who I went to school with, and I wasn't black enough for those who lived in Easton and St. Paul's, who I congregated with. And I think this idea of black excellence, unfortunately, sometimes can be quite materialistic, because it's if we're going to look at it in a very materialistic way, it's the house you live in, the postcode you have, it's the car that you might drive. And is that what black excellence really means, the material aspects that we look at someone racialized as white to have achieved? But for me, if I'm thinking about what black excellence do I want for my boys, I want both of my sons to genuinely feel that they can be who they want to be in their skin. I talked to you the other day and I said to you, rest is resistance. And there's something about black excellence being that you can breathe. You can choose the job that you want to do. You can live in the postcode that you want to be in. You can wear the clothing that you want to wear. And actually that's going to be valued. And that you're not going to be marked against almost a kind of a barometer of success based on whiteness, and that you're not going to be based on a barometer of success based on how poorly some black people are or how little they achieve. So ultimately, in a long, convoluted way, I'm saying for me, black excellence is freedom. And if you can feel a sense of freedom in whoever you are and how you show up, for me, that's excellence.
That's easy then to go on from there. No, I mean, just to go on, yeah, absolutely agree with what Aisha said. You know, I think if we look at all aspects of our society have been touched by African heritage people, music, art, you know, And I think what has happened actually is we've moved forward in lots of ways, but we've narrowed some of the ideas, as Aisha said, of what black excellence is. It's not something new, it's something we've always done, but it seems like we've kind of been crammed into this viewpoint of football player, singer, athletes. We can have a few chart surveyors, but you know, that's not something you do. Our children, as Aisha does a lot of work around representation matters. I speak to young people who don't ever think about being teachers because why would they? They've never seen a black teacher. If they have, they've seen a teaching assistant, they've seen a cleaner. They've never thought about being barristers because there are no ushers that are black in our courts in Bristol. Security are, the cleaners are. You know, my wife's a magistrate. The amount of time she's been told to go around the other way because this is for staff, you know, because she's got dreadlocks and she's a black woman. She's a magistrate, has been for 5 years working the child and adult court. She is still seen as someone when she enters the court, and then they will even see her behind the thing and call her mom, see her 5 minutes later and go, what are you doing? Turn down you can't speak it, because they're just seen as which side of the desk. So, you know, I think it's really, really important that we give space. As I said, black excellence always existed. I think we just need to recognise it.
I want to take your definition, to be honest,
Yeah.
on liberation, because mine is similar to yours, because I've really struggled with the term, where I think it was something for a long time to, aspire to and try and be the best. But then as I unpack, like, my own childhood and my own views of what, like, well, why can't I just be normal? why can I not be allowed to fail and be, like, slightly mediocre? But when you grow up with, like, immigrant parents, because my parents are from the Caribbean, so I'm first generation American, so I don't consider myself black American, I'm Caribbean. There is such a pressure to be the first to get your college education. There is such a pressure to do better than your white counterparts because you know that you're going to have it tough, and they're preparing you. They're preparing you for a hard world, which is sometimes just such a tiring way of growing up, because you're like, but I should be just loved for me. And so I've always struggled with that, having to aspire to this bigger thing, and especially growing up in New York, where it felt like the only outlet was to be a music person or a basketball player. Like, it felt very limited in what you can achieve. So I appreciate what you're both saying at the moment, because it's also making me think about, what are more liberating ways to think about what you want to strive for and what's excellent for you, right? What's good enough for me. So important for me is that we can come and see these plays from different places, but also bring it back and relate it to the place that we occupy and exist in. And I often struggle sometimes when people come and see American work, because they can easily say, oh, that's happening over there, and that's far from me. Oh God, those Americans are awful. So again, it was really also very important for me to do this first stage talk, and not just have, me, the director and the set designer, talking about the play. Like, I want to talk to Bristolians. I want to extend this conversation. And so thinking about the work that you both do here, what is it from the themes from this play that feel like really resonate for you, specifically around education here in Bristol?
I think, for me, if I just focus quite specifically on mental health and well-being, and if we think about how many children were affected, particularly post-COVID, and being at home and being in an environment and perhaps being outed to some of what was happening for them, whether it was their brain wiring and people getting diagnoses for ADHD and they didn't know. But what was really striking for me was the ability to demonstrate on stage in this play the idea to be vulnerable, and this idea about whether that was through the sexuality lens or the ability to comfort another individual without somebody using inappropriate terms like, oh, you're being gay. It was really interesting to see that unpacked and demonstrated in a very different way. And I think what I am seeing in this new generation is an exploration of what vulnerability means. And I think where I see connection in the play and where I can see connection in the children I'm working with now is they're saying, so miss, it is okay to be gender fluid. Miss, it is okay to experience my sexuality, and miss, it is okay to be vulnerable. And when we think about the facade or the bravado that is placed on black boys in particular, and that this play was kind of demystifying many of those aspects and breaking them down and showing you that this happens and it's okay, for me it was bridging a gap. Bridging a gap of permission that says, this is real, this is happening for you, and I want you to explore that level of intersectionality, and that you don't have to just be a caricature of who you think you are, but bring forward for us the elements of you that you're genuinely experiencing. And often when we see sometimes conversations around sexuality, there is much more of a comfort and acceptance of, if it is a female and black, people feel a bit more okay about accepting that. We might see that, shown in movies and music videos, and it almost becomes overtly sexualized. But we don't see as much of it through the lens of the gender of male, and also the black experience. And I think that level of intersectionality is so important because it gave permission. And I think that is what we're beginning to see in the education system, although the gap is very much still there.
Yeah.
Same question?
Yes.
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, I think for me, I think it was the opportunity to see things that I know are very real and are very vulnerabilities within a group of men, black men. And I think, as Aisha said, it was that permission to do that, because you do very much within media and expression, I believe, and it's hard for me because I don't live in everyone else's shoes, but from what I kind of can gather, that there is a one-dimensional to our young people. Adultification has allowed that to happen, and to see that vulnerability, and that there is depth to the experience of being a black male. It isn't just, and some of the young people that I deal with, there is a very much a struggle with their sexuality that I think, again, like mental health in the black community, goes unspoken because it is a taboo. And it's really important that we don't forget that there is a depth to our community that we need to acknowledge and embrace and celebrate as well. And I think it's very much, you can get yourself in the trap. I think they kind of call it the ghetto, where you're told what to think, you're told what to do, you're told how to, and you believe that that's all you can do. And I think it's a ghettoization that actually, as I said, the black excellence already exists. We just need to embrace it.
Mm. So I gave the context of what this elite institution is set in America. This is what I cannot speak to as not being raised here. I would love to understand your impressions around elite institutions and that history here in the UK, the impact it has on our society, benefits, disadvantages, just to understand.
I mean, I work with a lot of private schools, so, I had the opportunity to visit and train and experience some of the most, expensive schools in the country, shall we say. But it doesn't matter which school I am in, those black children always seem to seek me out, and they just want to let me know, Miss, can I just tell you? And it's like the exposure of the reality of what they're going through, and it's the hiding of their identity. So it feels that they have to make a choice. Do I speak for what it means to be black in my most authentic self and roots of who I am and my identity, or do I park that for the passport that being in this elite institution is going to provide? They want the benefits of the nepotism. That's what their parents have ultimately paid for. They want the opportunity to go to the Russell Group universities. It's all very transactional, but what I feel for many of these children is that part of that transaction is you lose your identity in order to get access to what is deemed to be excellence. And so when you have a child saying to me, I really want to get my hair done, but I know that, Miss, I could never rock up in an afro like you. That's not what I can do. And there is no one here that can help me. So when you're here on board, at boarding school, and you can't get access to the moisturizer you want to use on your skin, or the products that you need for your hair, and you're going, but that's basic, right? That's just humanity. That's just the ability to survive and live, and you can't even get access to that. It's the food that you want to eat, the music you want to listen to. They are censoring every aspect of who they are in exchange for the advantage that an education will provide in a particular institution, because they know in British culture that has much more value. And so it's a necessary sacrifice. I am not going to pretend for 1 minute that that transaction isn't real. And that put in a particular school or a particular university on your application, we know halo effect is real. We know people get jobs and opportunities. But the self-hatred that some of these young people have to go through in order to have that exchange, that's what hurts me. Because then I go, is it worth that? And then you go, but those parents have chosen it for a reason, because they've lived it, and they're going, but we want you to start here. We're trying to help you to kind of start on the next level. But it never feels like you can have both. And so that transactional experience is very interesting. And then when you compare that to a child who might go to a state school, they might not have access to the excellence in regards to kind of a stereotypical way of gaining it. But what they do have access to is who they are. And what's worth more. And that's why when I go back to what my definition is black excellence freedom. Because for some of those children in state schools, they've got a freedom that other children will never obtain. They don't have more money, but they get to be who they really want to be. And what equates to more value? I guess it depends on the individual.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I did a report recently into a local university around their staff, and one of the things following on for Aisha was some of these black and minoritized staff didn't really feel that they could bring themselves to work in their authentic persona, whether that came down to the kind of old, tropes of the food smelt or different, but actually, one staff member said they had to sit on the bus, go in and come in and relax or tighten up and become something they didn't feel that they could be. So these are lecturers and staff, in a university that is here. So I do think that that's really important, but also at the same time, I think we've got to be honest, as Aisha said. There's a system that's been in place for over 800 years, and we think that we're going to dismantle it by just thinking it. We've got to put in the heavy lifting, and yes, our aspirations are good, and that, but the work has to be done. You've got to move some timber, you've got to pull out that rug, you've got to sweep underneath and look underneath stuff and find the rats and and do all of that. And I think that's still to be done. I think there's a lot of goodwill, but goodwill, you can't eat goodwill. You have to actually do the work.
And who needs to do that, Des? Who needs to do that work?
We all need to do it, but I think we all need to have an agreement. And I think, as I said, we've transparency. We need to actually really sit down and have, I think, truth and reconciliation is really important. We've seen it in South Africa. We've seen it in Northern Ireland. Hopefully we can see it in the Palestine and Israel and these kind of, that there is a truth about what is happening and what's happened in the past. That people, I see around black people in Bristol when I talk about stop and search or we talk about policing. People are very traumatised in the black community, especially the African Caribbean community, because they'll talk about, I was stopped in 1984 and I've never resolved that stop and search because it was unjust and I'm angry. And there's this trauma that exists within certain communities that have never been realised. And I think that people kind of do feel, well, let's move on. We need to, but some people can't move on. And I think this happens in education too. I think that we've got to understand that we need to dismantle some of the systems that we have in place that are holding our goodwill back.
Yeah. Can I add something? Just something which, and I want to be fair because I don't want to leave the audience confused about the differences, because what I am going to say, in those elitist institutions, there is an absolute stark difference between children who are African Caribbean descent in those schools and children who are first generation migrants moving over from other countries in Africa. Because what I will say is I remember delivering an assembly and a Kenyan stopped me and he said, Miss, could you stop calling me black? And I said, oh, I'm sorry, how would you like me to address you? And he said, refer to me as Kenyan. It's not until I came to the UK that I understood there's this term black. It's not how I see myself. It feels like you're dehumanizing me when you're using a collective term of blackness. But I am a fiercely proud Kenyan, and my hair. And what I would say is the children who are coming first generation, they are so steeped in their history and their understanding
their experience often in the system of education here is very different. And the level of excellence that they perceive themselves to have is already there because they come from such rich cultures and rich understanding. So when you're explaining to them things like colonization or they're being taught things about enslavement, they're like, huh? Because to them it's not a real lived experience. They're like, that's not my history. That's not what I understand about myself. And so what's really important when we think about these elitist institutions is to make sure we don't go in homogenous and understand. So for someone like myself who's fourth generation, I wear the weight of enslavement and being taught black history and slavery and Martin Luther King and, you know, Sojourner Truth as my only truth. But they don't have that. So some of these children come over and there is a sense of pride in who they are, but what they have to do is fight against a narrative that's being pinned upon them because now they're just black.
And sorry, just to add that on that, because if you look at the exclusion rates and what's happening to our kids, it is the working class white kids and the black British kids who are actually underachieving. You've got Chinese kids, you've got West African kids, because I think their culture is there. I think the missing bit is what is our culture, and I will talk about class in the same breath as race, because I think that sometimes you can divide them, and that is actually part of the game that they want us to fight against each other. But actually, class and race, you know, if there's something that happens to kids when they come to Britain and within this culture thing, that they stop succeeding, whereas other people coming in from other places around the world will thrive under it, because, as Aisha said, I do think that there is this connection with a history, a purpose, and a narrative for yourself, and I think for a lot of people we don't have that here.
Thank you so much.
The guys there.
So I think the conversation portion of this is finished, and we're going to now open it up to the audience. This is great. Thank you so much. This is amazing. Any questions from the audience for us? No, thank you.
It's definitely not just elitist institutions that you have the difference in the types of black awareness. And thank you for drawing my attention to that, because that's something I kind of now see more. But I work near here in Trowbridge, where there's in a school where there's quite a diverse community. But you know, we need help. Actually, we need people to come in who don't look like me, because I'm trying to do stuff all the time in the lines that you're doing it, and I'm doing the very best I can. But we want people like you in schools in Trowbridge actually helping us and giving us resources so that we can speak to the very many children from the very many different backgrounds who want to hear these things but haven't got someone who's going to bring them here today. So please do help us and get the stuff out so that we can use it in other schools that's not in Bristol.
Yeah, what I would say in response to that is I think there are a number of things. I think on the one hand, there are lots of amazing free resources that if people are willing to just take a moment to look, there is. So when I think of, for example, off the top of my head, Lawrence Hu's Cargo Classrooms, beautiful resources talking about the abundance and the joy of black history. These are all things that schools can access. When I think about Integrate UK, phenomenal organisation, mostly offering all services for free to come in and do peer-to-peer education, so that young people are not just learning, they're learning from people that look and sound like them, but also learning from young people who have a different perspective. But what I'm also going to challenge some of these schools is about where they're willing to put their time and energy. Often what happens when it comes to anything around anti-racism, schools don't want to put a budget to it. So what they want is people like me to come for free and come and provide the resource, and yet they put resources to other aspects of education. So I guess my challenge, not to you personally, but my challenge to some of these education institutions is value someone's lived experience and education that they're bringing to you and equate time, energy, and money. If you genuinely want to see culture change, it shouldn't be something that people like myself in education have to volunteer our time to do. Invest in it the same way you do in any other aspect of education, because what I will say is ensuring that every child is safe in school is a safeguarding concern. So the same way we do safeguarding training for everything else, no child should ever feel safe in a school because of their racialized existence. And no child racialized as white should not have the right tools to make sure that they're not inadvertently causing racial harm because they haven't had the right support. And that's something that leadership teams in education have to choose to invest in. It's really, really important. So thank you for your point.
Hello, hi. Thank you, all three of you, for your time and what you've been talking about. And something that really, I think, stood out for me is this conversation around anti-blackness. And actually, what does that look like? Especially when it's something that's been ingrained in people for generations and generations. And I guess my question is, it feels like, especially in the work that I do in terms of diversity and inclusion, we're having these conversations of anti-blackness, but actually a lot of people are still not there to actually understand what it really means and how to kind of implement this. And I guess my question is that, for you, what would you say anti-blackness looks like in Bristol in terms of like, how do we get to a point as a city to truly be anti-black, and how do we kind of embed that in our cultural institutions and in our creative institutions as a whole?
Well, I think what we want to be is anti-racist. I think that the anti-blackness is something that we carry around, and that is the generational trauma that I think whiteness and blackness carries for generations on end. I think you're probably the best person to really answer this question. But what I will say about anybody that's doing this type of work is also thinking about the boundaries you put around yourself. And I know that the word self-care gets bandied around so much, but it is a lot of labor, and it is emotional labor. And when you work in predominantly white organizations and white spaces, you will understand that the work that you are doing is important to you because it affects your life. That isn't always the case with your colleague. And this is what I was mentioning before, you want it to become a personal value for that person then to say, oh gosh, there is anti-blackness in me, and I need to recognize that, move away from the guilty feelings of it, and actually, but what can I do to make my spaces better for me and for everyone? But I think, Aisha does this work.
I think what's interesting for me when I think about institutions, not just in education, but beyond that, is that we have to start treating our work around anti-racism like a competency that's required in order for you to work in our institution. And we've worked with a number of institutions have talked about how they're going to integrate this. And one particular organisation, even in their interview process, they have the question, is a two-parter. Part one is, what have you done for anti-racism lately personally? And what have you done for anti-racism lately professionally? Because what it does is it talks to holding you to account, to be genuinely honest about the activeness that's required in terms of anti-racism. A lot of people are quite happy to sit in the realm of non-racist, but the problem with that is that sometimes your silence can equate to violence, and sometimes your silence perpetuates the oppression, even if it's not your intention. So this idea of wanting to fight against it means that you have to be honest about what's happening. Now, a lot of people don't understand anti-blackness specifically, because what we're talking about now is a specific hatred that only black people experience. So now we're going into hierarchy of racialized experience. But we have to be honest that, if I'm Southeast Asian, what I might experience for racism is not going to be the same as someone who's Black African. And it doesn't mean that what somebody perhaps is Chinese has experienced is of any lesser value to someone who is from Nigeria. But what it means is it looks different. It manifests itself different. It compounds itself different. And what sometimes people don't understand is that sometimes it's happening inter-community. And whether that's happening in things like hairism, if it's happening in things like colorism, communities themselves are creating their own internal hierarchies. And so there's so much nuance to this. And when I think about specifically the experiences of black women, particularly dark-skinned black women, this idea of misogynoir, this specific hatred, that level of harm and violence that is applied to them is often not unpicked by organisations. But when you think about this idea of angry black women and not being able to show up, I then can't be the real me. I've got a tone police, I've got to silence myself, I've got a mask before I step into my institution. Even myself as a woman who might be a lighter skinned black woman, I know there's privilege even within that. So what's really important
is hearing the voices who are the most marginalised. So let's stop creating opportunities and courses and projects and not even checking with the very people who it's causing the most hurt and harm to, because I need to know from you. But it's also about having that uncomfortable conversation and saying that there is no nice racism. So this idea of, oh, well, I'll do the bit about the N-word and the P-word because I can deal with that. But nobody wants to look at the nuances of what a black woman is experiencing with her 4C hair when someone's saying she's aggressive and doesn't want to give her a job opportunity because in their conduct policy around hair and uniform, it says no extreme hairstyles, and African Caribbean hair is used as the example. So it's about allowing yourself to go to that level of nuance. If you really want to look at anti-blackness, you have to be willing to look as to what that actually means. And then when you see it, do something about it. And that's the bit that people don't want to do. I'm happy to see it, but I don't want to change it because they're worried it's a transaction. If I do something for this community, but then that means that this community is going to lose. Rather than using the rising tide analogy, which is actually all of the boats can rise. If we genuinely work together, nothing's going to mean that someone else is going to lose. We're all going to get to thrive, and that's what equity is. Give me what I need to thrive. That's all we're asking for.
Yeah, and just with that, I mean, there's no neutrality, you know, and I think that's, you can't just say, well, I can see it, but what can I do? I think it is actively being anti-racist, you know, it's not passively being that and recognising it, it is actually being active in that process, and I think that's a question that we all have to ask, doesn't matter where you're from, how am I actively being anti-racist?
Is this on? Oh.
Yeah.
My question is still a baby question. I've not quite formed how it needs to be worded just yet. Thinking about Bristol Old Vic and thinking about how to communicate anti-racism to the rest of the city. I need help. How, in my role, I manage a lot of the social media channels. I would love to be more radical about the work that's happening and that needs to happen through that. But I don't know how to do that.
That's really interesting. I think one of the things, you know, I've been working with Bristol Old Vic some time now around its experience and what it would mean to be an anti-racist theatre. It's quite a bold statement to make. But I think it's everything from the small to the big. So one of the most interesting things for us was when, Nancy, was just before your time, but when there was a commitment made around being anti-racist, somebody walks in and sees plantation rum on the shelf. And the person says, well, if you're truly anti-racist, why is Bristol Old Vic selling plantation rum? And then you're going, ooh, what do I do? So the reaction of the organisation in that moment was, well, we take that off the shelf. We go back to our contractors around our food and our drink, and we immediately inform them of our commitment, and we don't do that again. That's a small incidental moment, but it shows that individual who's invested, this is my case study, this is my experience, this is what I had, I can see it. That's one at the end of the spectrum. You compare that to having Choir Boy on the stage. Probably 5 years ago, that wouldn't have been the play that would have been here. We're changing the type of programming that's happening. And so what's really important when we think about being radical about it, it is about those interpersonal experiences and actually feeling the change that's happening here and being unapologetic about telling the stories, whether they were positive or negative, because there's so much more learning, not in the things that went well, but in the things that didn't. And actually, what was the reaction of the theatre when they got it wrong? And that shows growth more than, oh, that's a brilliant performance and play. Actually, what did you do when that person challenged you? They didn't feel it met the marker of what it meant to be anti-racist.
Yeah, I feel that the anti-racism work has to hit every level of every single thing that we do in this theatre, not just what we put on our stages, but I hear you on the desire to want to be more radical. And I think I'm a lot older than you as well, and I just feel like I've been doing this for so long and change feels so slow. And the hurdles that we currently have in our economic climate just make it even more difficult to try and get that change in as quickly as possible. But I think that the best and most impactful thing that an organization can really do is to take a punt on the work. You know, continue to really live by our values and work by our values and say, gosh, I need more diverse stories. We need to be putting this into the programming when we're doing our marketing. We need to be thinking about what does this image say, and really interrogating these things. It's actually doing the hard work and not relying on the way that things have always been, or the way that the formula that has worked for before. Because at the moment, what we're trying to do is be so much more inclusive and understand that we need to learn how to speak to a different community, to a different audience, and that we're not the experts of that, and that we'll get stuff wrong, but we really actually have to do it and work hard at it. I don't know if that completely answers your question, because I think I'm asking myself that question all the time.
I do think also, though, I think it goes back to the earlier question I think asked at the back about resources for school. I think I'm often asked by different organisations, a lot of law enforcement, you know, what books can I read for Black History Month? And I used to do it very regularly, and I kind of got tired because you can Google it, really. You could, if you're interested, you can find out yourself. And again, you know, it was a lot of responsibility on me and kind of the trauma. Am I giving the right book? Am I trying to say the right thing? Oh, but maybe they need to, you know. And actually, I think around this work, there's, you know, hopefully things like this, a conversation, but that conversation takes work on both sides. I think it's okay, and I think sometimes what I feel people won't speak to me because they're checking themselves. And actually, if you do the work, you don't need to check yourself. We can have an open conversation, and I'm more than happy, as you know, you can see, I like to talk. And I love to be challenged, and I love to challenge too. And I think that we need to do more of that, but we all need to be in a place of knowledge when we do it, so understanding each other, how we respond to communication, how to communicate with each other, but also being vulnerable. And I think a lot of the kind of problem with conversations is we're not vulnerable enough. We don't like to say, I don't know, but, you know, or can you help me? And so I think for me, that's the thing that we can do the most, is actually start having proper conversations about proper things rather than skirting around the edges.
Okay, sorry. We are at time.
So the play's been cancelled. We're on stage.
The play's still going on. Don't worry about it. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and taking out the time to listen to this conversation, which has been just fantastic. I really want to thank Aisha and Desmond for being here with us today. I don't know who's seen the show or who's seeing it later, but enjoy and have a good rest of your afternoon. Thank you.